John here with Ripewave Audio and back again a third time with Sony's flagship AV receiver, the STR-AZ7000ES. And this time we're going to take a look at some of the user experience items from the remote to the front panel to on-screen display and web configuration. And along with that, some of the sound modes, in particular, Sony's new Spatial Sound Mapping technology, along with their digital cinema auto calibration system, and how those two work with each other and what functions they do provide. Now we're going to start by taking a look at the front panel here of the receiver. We'll remove this cover, which is held on by magnets, and of course this is something that has not been received well by everyone, including ourselves, thinking that could get lost. But let's take a look at this. There's a lot of buttons here. There is a ping button. There's buttons for selecting your input. There is the display here, and this is a classic LCD display here. You can adjust the tones. Now this is just bass and treble, as we found with the EQ in the last video, that there isn't much more than just bass and treble adjustment for tones. There isn't a full PEQ in this model. There is ability to select the speakers, A, B, or A plus B. There's the place to put on the calibration mic. There is an HDMI out button where you can select which HDMI is going to go off for your zones. And there is a USB connection and adjustment of which zone is going to be selected, 2 or 3. There is tuner buttons. There is Bluetooth connection. So by pushing the Bluetooth button, you can do some pairing with your Bluetooth devices. And you can test the pitch. We'll get more to that later. And do test tones with your speaker, all from what's in the panel here. And we're starting to see the theme here is they're really having it easy for the integrator to just hit that button from the front panel, or multiple other ways to do that within the system. Maybe a bit much from our perspective. But there's also a pure direct button and menu navigation buttons on this unit with the arrows that are very much similar to what is in the remote. Now we talked about the in-ceiling speakers. You can actually activate in-ceiling speaker mode where you're using those versus floor standing speakers, and they're kind of brought down to the ear level. And then you can choose your sound field, and you also are given a 7th HDMI video jack into this, and that final button, which is the 360 spatial sound mapping button. We're going to talk more about that's use going forward here. Now if we look at the remote, many of the same functions are here, less the ping and a few other things. The test buttons actually are still here at the bottom. Again, they're really trying to make it easier for that home stereo integrator on this. But again, I think these are just a little too convenient. Why would the average homeowner be needing to have instant access to those test buttons? But that's just my opinion. Of course, you can give your feedback on that. A lot of the same buttons are here for selecting your input and your 360 mode. Now there is one button here that I find quite interesting. It's called Amp Menu. And when you push the Amp Menu, it does not present on the screen, although it gives you a little smaller thing in the bottom right. Now imagine if you're watching a movie with other people and you want to change some settings, but you don't want to disturb other people, you can hit the Amp Menu button, and it will only do your selection from using the display on the receiver itself and not disturb everybody that's watching it. Now that's a good feature in itself. The only problem I find with it is the display is so small, you have to be near the display. You can't just sit from your chair and adjust it. So that I find a little bit lacking. This is where the web app comes in a little handy. We'll get to that in a second. Of course, you have all your arrows. The option button is there, and we'll talk about its usage in a second here. the home button as well. These will bring up different types of menus on screen. Look, there's a pure direct button, and of course the volume button is there on this remote. The custom button's there, and you can push and hold that, sort of like holding your seat position in the car. You push and hold it for a few seconds, and it saves something as a custom setup. And as we talked about at the bottom here, there is some test, and it gets you into the settings for the further configuration of this unit. The display button that's up here, that will toggle between different modes, and we'll look at that. Some of these buttons we'll get into a little further as we exercise these, but it gives you a general sense of what's on the remote. And you're looking at this side by side, you can see the duplication between these two. Now, if we look just at the display, you can see how small some of these indicators are. You have to get really close to it. This picture probably does it better than in real life. If you go and look at the manual for this, there are 26 different indicators on this display, and they're quite small. Everything from the playback indication of what speakers are active. Now, this is pretty common nowadays, but these are smaller than, I think, the average one. It even gives you the indicator for that second center channel, should you be able to set that up, or even if you've got this in a bi-amp mode. And you have subwoofer that lights up, etc., all giving these indications. There's even an update indicator when there's an update available for the software. This would be great if you could actually see it, and a few other things like DSD native, etc. Great things to display. I just wish it was a little easier to see. And as you go through, there's other things about whether the room calibration is being applied, if there's Bluetooth going on, if there's automatic phase matching, if you're doing the dynamic room correction, if the EQ is being activated, if you're doing Neural X, the IMAX, DTSX, etc., 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 for the surround modes, and your 360 spatial sound mapping, which they abbreviate as 360 SSM, and they, of course, input indicators. Another way for you to interact this, if you hit the home button on the remote, it brings up this menu on screen. And it's divided the inputs into inputs you watch that have video associated with them, and inputs you just listen to, which don't have video. So if you go and look at the watch ones, these are the defaults that they set up. You can go and edit which appears on this menu. We'll talk about that a little further on. The listen menu, again, choices of what inputs you'll listen to. The good news is an input can be in both the watch and the listen menus. For example, your ultra high definition Blu-ray player can play CDs, it can play movies, it can play Blu-ray audio, and so there isn't always video associated with what's coming out of your ultra high definition Blu-ray player today. Then they have custom presets, but they only give you two, one for movie and one for music. And if you hit the options button, you can go and configure these. There is also a sound effects choice from the home menu. And this is where you can choose the sound field, whether the equalizer is going to be on, the 360 spatial sound mapping mode, the in-ceiling speaker mode, and if pure direct is turned on. Of course, some of these won't work in certain combinations. Then you have a zone control selection, and this is whether you're going to power up zone 2 or zone 3 and how that's going to work and what the input in volume is going to be. And then there is the setup button, which takes you to the setup screens, which we used a lot in the last video. Now, if we go into input settings, this is where you can configure the home menu presentation and a lot of the defaults that goes along with this. So let's go in and take a look at these input setups. And here you can go in and configure how each of these inputs are going to display on the home menu and have for default settings and triggers as they get selected either by the home menu or by other means. So for example, this first input defaults to game. We can change its icon Some of these icons look more like the source that is default labeled for. Others, like the cassette tape player, to me this does not look like a cassette deck. Apparently they didn't grow up in the 80s. But anyhow, there are some choices for your inputs, and I do think game looks really good with the controller. You can change the name from the default, so if I want to change this to PS5 or Nintendo Switch, I could do that. And we can determine if this is going to show up in the watch window, the listen menu, or both. And you could decide to hide some of these if you do not have a certain source. So if there's no auxiliary or no cable TV, we could hide that. The HDMI, we can choose which HDMI port it's going to use. It's very flexible in this way. Does it have an optical or coax? Now, in some cases, depending on the input, it's not going to give you a choice of certain things. Like here, while I can choose optical or coax for the audio, I can't go and choose a video from an analog source. But on input 4, I can choose video. And we can choose the default input mode, whether that's going to be auto or analog. And we can choose the preset that we want for the sound field. We can choose whether it's going to be in ceiling speaker mode, if there's going to be some synchronization for lip syncing, and if the low pass subwoofer filter is going to be used. And those are the settings there. And we can also determine if we're going to adjust the preset gain. If you have a source that has a little quieter or a little louder, we can boost or cut that accordingly. And then finally, for triggers, we have up to 3 triggers here, and we can determine if this particular input is going to be associated with any one of the 3 triggers or all of them. So a lot of flexibility on the input setup. Now we have another choice for doing your configuration, not just the on-screen menu. There is the web page. And if you want to know the web page address, you can hit the ping button here, or you can go into the network settings in your on-screen display to get that IP address. Mine was 10.0.0.178. I typed that into a browser on the same network, but when it came up, it said service unavailable. So what you have to do is you have to go down to one of the last menu choices called Install Settings, number 9, and turn External Control on. By default, this is turned off. I guess they do this for security reasons. But if you go and select this to on, and finally, when you bring up the browser with that turned on, you can see all these settings exposed. And some of you will prefer to operate in the web page versus the on-screen display. But the good thing is you have an option here. Now, I do find the web page updates a little slowly, not as snappy as others we have used, but we're glad to see this here. Now, this web page is really for configuration. I don't see this as a web UI for playback necessarily, but I do find it great for A/B comparisons. If I want to switch from one mode to another, it switches those modes a lot more quickly than from the setup menus on screen. So I do recommend it if you have a mobile device that you can bring up the web page and sit at your listening position and toggle with some of these sound modes and put them on or off. You can experience the effect directly between the two of them. Now, the other thing that you have at your disposal is a display. So if you hit the display button, that will turn on, for playback purposes, an on-screen display versus a setup display. And this was showing you I'm using the input called Media Box. It's determined that the source material is a Dolby Atmos running at 48 kilohertz, which is what we expect from an Apple TV, and that I have 360 spatial sound mapping turned on. If I push it again, it gives me the HDMI signal information, and we can see this here as a 4K source at 60 hertz using SDR. But it's still showing me the audio format. And if I push it one more time, it goes away. While this display is pretty clear and easy to read, it doesn't provide a lot of information. I think it would have been much better if Sony took a lot of the details that they're putting on the front of this unit and made that available, if not optionally available, on the on-screen display, or make a web page that displayed the same elements on here, very much the way that Monoprice did with the HTP1, which I thought was one of the best implementations of a front display, because it was really clear what your source was and what you were outputting for signal to your speakers. Now you have a variety of sound modes when you go to play this back. It'd be 2-channel mode, it can be multi-stereo, it can be direct. They have something called AFD, and this baffled me to begin with, but this is what Sony calls auto format decoding, and all it's just a fancy way of saying it's going to pick a decoder that best matches the source. Most receivers or processors just call this auto. Why give it a 3-letter acronym? I do not know. Then you have sound modes for movie. These sound modes, by the way, match up what's on the remote. We have a 2-channel multi, movie, music, and then you have 360 buttons on that line. For movie, you got AFD movie, automatic format decode. You have Dolby and DTSX mode. For music, you have a choice of audio enhancer, which uses their DC, Digital Sound Enhancement Engine Ultimate. So what I understand with this, it only works with 2-channel music, and if it has a sampling frequency of 44.1 kilohertz or 48 kilohertz, it will try to upsample the source material so it sounds more dynamic, more rich. This is a technology I also have on my Blu-ray player. I don't usually use it. The other display you have is if you hit the option button, this pops up at the bottom of your screen. It tells you if you have pure direct on, IMAX mode, your sound field, your 360 spatial sound mapping, if you have dual mono going, the AV sync, and the DTS dialogue control. So that is displayed at the bottom of the screen. Now let's talk about calibration. As we left off in the last video, we had done a DCAC IX calibration. So DCAC stands for Digital Cinema Auto Calibration. This is Sony's own proprietary technology. So what actually happened when we ran this? Well, it did a 3D speaker compensation for the following: the sound level, the size of the speaker, albeit they set the size all to large, and not all my speakers are large. I mean, you could argue maybe my towers could be rated as large, but some might even set those to small. But to set them all to large, so I'm not sure how the algorithm works, or even if it does determine the size. And because it set them all to large, it didn't make an attempt to set the crossover frequency. So those all got set the same at 120 hertz. And I had to go and manually set everything to small and pick crossover frequencies I wanted. Let me know if you had any different experience when you ran your calibration. You'll also do phase matching, and this you can turn on or off. Then you have a choice of a calibration type. So when it measures the frequency response here, it can then apply and try to make everything flat, to make everything match a Sony standard room, which they call Engineer, or try to match your front speakers. So if you think you like the way your front speakers sound and you want all the other ones to closely resemble that, this is where you would set front reference. Or you could just turn off any frequency adjustment by hitting off. But keep in mind, there's no manual adjustment other than a treble and a bass boost and cut for each speaker, unless you're using this auto calibration. And then this DCAC also does placement and delay. It measures the distance, the height, and the angle in a three-dimensional space. And as such, it's able to do the delays appropriately. That is the basic DCAC. Next, you have a second layer of calibration, which they call speaker relocation or phantom surround back. So what this will do is look at the way it will look at the measurements it took for all your speakers. They're most likely not in the ideal positions, and try to virtually reposition those so that they are in the ideal positions virtually. And if you don't have surround back speakers, it can virtually create surround back speakers by using your other speakers to give the illusion that you do. And you have some choices here. You have a type A and a type B and an off, and we'll take a look at that in a second, what each one of those means, but it's doing a virtual distance, a virtual height, virtual angle for your speakers to make them appear to be in the ideal position. Now, with this latest generation of receivers, Sony has added the feature of 360 spatial sound mapping. And the idea is to make things sound more spacious and appear to have more speakers in the room. What is unclear to me is if I have a full complement of speakers, if I had front wides, fronts, side surrounds, rear surrounds, multiple rows of heights, what's left to map special? Because they say that you can only do up to 13 channels total, real plus virtual, of these speakers. Now, I don't have front wides, so what it may be doing is simulating the front wides. In my case, I have just about everything else. Again, you're only limited to 13 channels, and your only setting on this is on or off, so there's no fine-tuning this. Let's take a look at first the speaker relocation. What does this do? So with Type A, which is really designated as being for movies, it tries to emulate the standard Dolby angles and positions for your speakers. So you'll notice that your side surrounds for Type A, the side surrounds are 115 degrees from your center speaker. If you go to set it to the music setting, Type B, that's only 75 degrees from center. So this means that with Type B, the side surrounds are going to try to be more forward of the listening position versus Type A with movies behind the listening position. Now with the rear surrounds, the adjustment is a little more subtle. So for Type A, for movie, they set it at 150 degrees from center versus music Type B, 145 degrees. So in both cases, the language for the height speakers seems to be the same whether you select Type A or Type B, and they make them directly aligned with the front speakers, parallel right through the room. They don't mention rear heights. They just talk about height front and middle, but I'm sure it would apply equally to height rear. So what does this look like when you go into the screen? It's initially set to off. You go turn it to Type A, and they show this speaker moving. But I'm wondering, this doesn't seem to be how much my speakers are virtually moving, because if I look at the center speaker, my center speaker is center. It's not off to the side as shown here. So I think this is not a representation of how much it's moving your speakers, but conceptually what it's doing for Type A versus looking at Type B, what it's conceptually doing for Type B. And I don't see anywhere else in the menus that really show how much it's trying to move it when you put it into these modes. So if you know more about this, let me know, but I don't think there's any way this system is letting us know how much it's virtually trying to move our speakers. Now with sound mapping, the 360 spatial sound mapping must be done after auto calibration is performed, you must at least have a 4.0.0 channel configuration, and you must perform it before you turn this on. It can't be used with headphones, and it doesn't seem to be used with Bluetooth devices in the transmit setting. And it only can be used in certain sound modes. So it can be used in multi-stereo, except for 2-channel, the automatic format decode, or automatic format decode movie, or audio enhancer. But if you have it explicitly set to Dolby Surround or DTSX, it doesn't work. So let's see how all this comes together. First, you have your DCAC. It does the 3D speaker compensation. Then you can optionally turn on the speaker relocation or phantom surround back. And you can also turn on the 360 spatial mapping. And so 2 and 3 can be done independently of each other. And what I believe happens is you have your source material, whether that's formats like Dolby Digital or DTS HD, or the immersive formats, Dolby Atmos, DTSX. The non-immersive formats can run through the up mixer that's relative to them. Once the decoder has determined where these objects should be, then the Sony technology comes in and maps them appropriately of where they should appear in hemispherical space in your room, and doing up to 12 phantom speakers. So when we run this, the levels were determined, and these seem appropriate, and I've got it all through the room. They determine the distance from my main listening position. Some of these seem right, and some of them I think I want to go in and manually change because they don't all make sense to me, especially the subwoofer being 16 feet. But is it really measuring distances, or what is it really might be doing is that's the distance that lines up with the time delay it thinks it needs for that speaker because of various characteristics in your room. So maybe don't always be fooled by the numbers not seeing right. Distance from the screen. Now, again, I wish I knew more about what it's doing behind the scenes, whether I should correct this to what it actually is or what they actually measured. And the same thing with height. Now, one would think the height of all my ceiling speakers should be the same height, and they're not listed here. They all should come out to about 7'6", and I'm getting different values. And then the size of the speaker, this is where I said initially this all picked up as large, and I went and changed these to small. Adjusted the crossover frequencies because it didn't do them because it set them all to large. And then the other thing that you can do is determine what you want for the subwoofer low pass filter settings. This is in audio settings. This will allow more information to come to your subwoofer. So I normally would turn that on. The other things that you can find under audio settings, of course, your sound fields and whether you're going to be DSD and pure direct and everything like that. But they have the dual mono, they have DRC, up mixing set to auto, and then there's the IMAX support menu. And if you select that, you can change the crossover and other features that are specific to IMAX. Then there is on the zone settings menu, you can go in and click onto your zone and determine whether you're going to use that zone for music and video or just music, and it shows you some of the wiring that can be done for those. For menu choice 7, which is Bluetooth, this is one thing I wanted to point out is while this has both a Bluetooth receiver, that's if you have a music running on your mobile device and you want to send it to your receiver, you set to receiver. If you want the receiver to transmit to headphones or a wireless speaker, then you hit it to transmitter. But it doesn't appear that you can have both of those radios on at once. But you can turn them both off. System settings, one that I recommend going in, auto standby, I think it defaults to off, and this is where I like it. I don't like this thing shutting off after 20 minutes. I want to explicitly turn it off, but some of you may want to have that happen if you forget to turn it off. And there's other things about changing the brightness of the display. You're not going to be able to read it anyways from where you're sitting, so set it to whatever you want. So that runs through some of the configurations and the setup that you have to go through as a user. What are your thoughts? Do some of these baffle you, or do you, like the way they went and implemented this? That feedback would be useful to the Ripewave audio community. And also weigh in on how they're doing that 360 spatial sound mapping. I'm trying to make sense of it. There's not a lot of clear information. I wish Sony would release more details about what's going on behind the scenes there. And if you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to this channel. And if you want to take your involvement to the next level, we do have our Patreon channel at www.patreon.com/Ripewave. And you can always do a one-time donation. I've seen a bunch of you do that. Thank you so much. That helps this channel continue to do content, and it doesn't cost any money if you want to just hit that bell notification so you'll notified when the next video is posted. Until then, keep evolving your audio experience.